Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual meeting on COVID-19 education legislation. We wanted to take an opportunity to update you on what we're seeing as far as legislative trends in education legislation on COVID-19, and also to provide an opportunity for all of you to share about the work that you're doing in your state and perhaps discuss some pieces of legislation that you all have been considering in your state or maybe have enacted. Before we get started today, just a few reminders about protocol for the meeting. We want to be sure that you join by video, and please show your video screen. We'd love to see everyone who is joining us today. This really helps it feel a lot more like an in-person meeting, which I think we're all missing and hoping to have soon. Also, please add your full name to your tile so that we can all see who's joining us today. Share your name as well as your state. That really helps us to identify who is joining us. Please be sure to mute your line unless you are speaking, and there will be an opportunity later for both questions and discussion. So we're going to ask you to unmute your line today and participate fully in the discussion. You may also virtually raise your hand to be recognized today as well. And you can type your questions or your comments or information that you want to share in the chat box on the right side of your screen. We'll be asking you to share some responses to questions, but we also would love to have you, like I said, unmute your lines and share with us today in person. And please be sure not to share your screen under any circumstances, just to make sure that we keep everything the way it's supposed to be and viewing the slides that we have in front of us. As a reminder, this meeting is recorded and it is archived along with the slides and any other materials that are relevant on NCSL's webpage. You can see the link right down there, and you can certainly ask us to send you that link as well. So for today, just a quick preview of today's agenda. We will be kicking off with just a quick review of the activity that we're seeing right now in legislative sessions. I'll be doing that review, and then we will have discussion on both P12 legislation as well as post-secondary legislation led by both Andrew and Jorge of our team who do the bulk of that tracking. And then we'll have plenty of times for both questions and discussion, and then we'll share with you the resources that we have at NCSL that can help you track this information yourself. So just a quick overview of what we're seeing in the states right now. As you know, many states quickly and abruptly ended their sessions in March when we had quarantines in most states. Other sessions ended in April. And then, as you can see, we've continued to sort of snowball with that action. Some states are actually coming back into special session. You might be one of those states that are heading back into special session, or you may have effectively adjourned, as I said, or come back in special session, or you may have just recessed. For example, Colorado recessed and they just came back into session yesterday to finish the work that they need to finish. In most cases, we're seeing most of those discussions are around budgets and the amendments that are having to be made to the budget for next fiscal year. But there's also a good amount of legislation that is addressing a whole variety of policy areas, things that maybe the legislature needs to codify, or emergency funding, or you know, for example, for distance learning, or to deal with student loans or things like that. And so we'll be talking a lot of that as it relates to education today. As you will see, there are a number of states that are not technically in session this year: North Dakota, Nevada, Missouri, and Texas. That's not to say that they won't need to come back in and finish up their business, but those states were not scheduled to be meeting this year. All right, so we're going to ask you to type in the chat box. Please let us know if your state is finished with our legislative session for the year. And will you be resuming regular session or going into special session? This just helps us give us an idea of the legislative action that's going on in your particular state. So if you can share that, that would be great. And we will go ahead and begin our discussion and our coverage of the legislation that we're seeing across the state. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jorge.
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I just wanted to present us with two maps. One that began in April at the beginning of the pandemic, and one taken yesterday. These are provided by Quorum. As you can see here, this stark change in the number of bills introduced throughout the US. These are bills related to COVID-19 in general, not necessarily education only. This speaks volumes to the curious nature of pandemic response in state legislatures and the ability of those legislatures to respond to them in a timely fashion. Executive orders and state education agencies have produced most of the guidance. But I wanted to point out that there's a lot of activity on the East Coast. New York has introduced 242 bills, Massachusetts 216, Ohio 77, and Minnesota 160 as an example. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we've been able to identify approximately 140 bills related to education during the COVID-19 pandemic. Although I begin drawing attention to waivers, introduced legislation most often related to budgetary issues. Legislatures across the US have made an attempt to codify some decisions by state education agencies and governors, but waivers are one form of that. States have provided waivers to school districts to allow them to be able to shut down for the remainder of the pandemic, remainder of the school year rather. And these waivers often relate to instructional hours, promotional requirements, and testing. Ohio's HB 585 is an example of one of those bills. Next slide, please. States also prioritize school employee welfare. Many states introduced legislation related to the well-being of school staff that took form in different sanitation requirements and funding appropriated to provide cleaning supplies to make those work environments sanitary, and also ensure that teachers are paid throughout the remainder of the school closures. An example of that is New Jersey's AB 3856, which appropriates approximately $10 million for the sanitation of healthcare, residential, and other facilities, including schools. And New York's AB 10153, which also ensures that schools will pay out up to 14 days of sick time for any employee. Next slide, please. Another major issue, as we all know, is remote learning. Many schools have been tasked with providing resources and different technology for their students. And so states have introduced legislation to help schools bolster those technology supplies and also provide those online resources for teachers as well as for students. And many states are now considering building out the infrastructure for the next school year as we might transition to future online learning. North Carolina's SB 859 is an example of that. This introduced legislation. It will be appropriating $176 million for the expansion of the school connectivity initiative through the partnership with North Carolina State University. Next slide, please. One back, please. And I wanted to point out a couple of bills that were interesting. Obviously, there are over 125 bills related to K-12 education exclusively. These two bills are interesting in that they provide different pipelines for educator development and also a bridge year plan for those high school students who did not, or whose school closed during the pandemic and whose school year was going to be affected by the pandemic next year. Next slide, please.
So I'll give an overview of kind of the higher education front. So really, when we're talking about higher ed, we're dealing with sort of two big issues in that we had both the abrupt closure of campuses in the middle of the spring semester, and we're dealing with uncertainty about what the fall is going to look like, both in terms of reopening campuses and enrollment numbers. So we've obviously seen a lot of action at the institutional level, and there's major higher ed provisions in the CARES Act, but we've also seen some state legislation that I'll just kind of go over real quick to give an overview of what we've been tracking. So the first area that we've seen is dealing with kind of the fallout of those closures in the spring and looking at refunds and reimbursements for student housing and dining plans, room and board fees, Most colleges already took this step and issued either refunds or credits for the spring semester, but these bills would look at kind of standardizing that process statewide, especially as it applies to public institutions. And this is kind of in the context of a broader push by students via both petitions and lawsuits to try and get tuition refunds, which is something we've not seen a lot of in the legislation that we're following, but will be something to watch certainly as we move into the fall. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So the next area that we've been following legislation about is related to student loans. And we know that the Federal CARES Act provided relief to most borrowers, but some borrowers with older loans and with private loans might not be receiving those same benefits of relief. And so these bills that we've been following at the state level would expand sort of that umbrella of the suspension of payments or interest and deferring of payments to sort of expand the protections for borrowers. Most of them look at doing it through the same time frame as the CARES Act, which is the end of September, but other bills have looked at tying this sort of directly to disaster or emergency declarations in states. And so if we can go to the next slide, kind of related to student loans, there's also a broader set of issues around state financial aid programs. And this is kind of a two-pronged issue here, in that we've seen a lot of bills looking at existing state financial aid programs, mainly related to the flexibility of those programs, because you've had pretty much complete disruption of the high school completion process and the college admissions process. So you may not have testing to determine eligibility. You've got colleges that have changed their deadlines across the board. So many states have needed to make modifications to their financial aid programs, to their scholarship programs, and some of those changes can be done in some states by state agency, and some governors have done some work on this, but in other cases there needs to be legislative work done to ensure those programs have flexibility. And then the other prong of the financial aid issue is actually bills looking at creating new forms of financial aid, new scholarship programs or loan forgiveness. And mainly what these bills have looked at doing is creating these kind of programs for first responders or frontline medical personnel or essential workers, things like that. So we'll go to the next slide. So shifting a bit out of the financial aid realm into the emergency preparedness side of this equation, the decisions about reopening campuses and how operations will proceed in the fall are going to be handled mainly at the institutional level, but we've seen some interest from state legislators looking at requiring schools to develop emergency preparedness plans and how schools would function if they were forced to be primarily or completely online in the fall, doing online and distance education. So we've seen a few bills looking at that sort of issue. And then we'll go to the last slide of the higher ed component is sort of just a few topic areas. The first being a discussion, and a discussion that's probably going to be larger than higher ed, about liability for institutions as they reopen, both having students on the campus and as some of them provide resources in terms of testing or personal protective equipment. How does the liability issues be addressed there? We've also seen, we know a lot of colleges moved to a pass-fail grading system for this past semester, and that could potentially create challenges for the transfer and articulation of credits, both within a college or applying to grad school, things like that. Most systems aren't really built for a large number of pass-fail grades in one semester. So we've seen some interest about states making sure that those credits are able to transfer. And then more broadly, the last big category is the looming challenging budget situations, both as schools face potentially declining enrollments and as states face a really uncertain budget situation. So we're continuing to follow those, and that's all I have. I'll turn it over to you, Michelle.
Thank you both for that great update. It's been really fascinating to see what states feel like they need to tackle through legislation, aside from just the just the budget piece. We know the budget piece is probably going to be the very biggest piece for most of you. And so, so we are super interested in seeing what other types of things you feel like you need to codify, or other concerns that you can and feel like you should be addressing through legislation. So at this point, what we want to do is have a discussion rather than just a chatter in the chatter box. We'd love for you to open up your lines and tell us what was your legislature's biggest legislative accomplishment this year in education. It may or may not have been related to COVID. And if it wasn't related to COVID, do you feel like that's something that's going to stick going forward as you're having to make these choices about what continues or what unfortunately needs to be cut? And do you have a bill that you would like to share with your colleagues that you think has been really important in the wake of COVID? So go ahead and open up your lines. We'd love to have you participate. And just a warning that I am not afraid to call on people. So I am happy to do that if I need to do that. Who wants to jump in?
Okay, I'll jump in if nobody else is going to.
Thank you. I know the silence is painful.
In silence.
I know sometimes we have to do that.
Yeah, right before we recessed for a while. So in Arizona, we recessed about mid-March, shortly right after our state called school closures. So in that last week, we managed to put together some legislation that allowed a lot of flexibility so that schools could continue to teach students at home. Whether it be through distance learning or packets sent home. They could use buses and other transportation to get both food and assignments and communications between the home. And it's been pretty successful, obviously more successful in some districts than others. But I feel like we were able to cover most of those major concerns and uncertainty that everyone was facing. And allow students to finish this school year and still get something out of the rest of the school year, even though they were at home.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting to hear for sure. That's very helpful. Thank you. It looks like we have a couple of people on from Washington. Does someone from Washington want to jump in?
Hi, Michelle. This is Sharon Tomiko Santos. I don't know who the other person from Washington might be.
Lisa Callan. It's Lisa.
Oh, Representative Callan. Actually, I was going to mention one of her efforts. Just by way of background, Washington is on a schedule of a short session year during an election year. So we had a 60-day session this year, which was scheduled to adjourn sine die March 12th, and we did. But that was just about the time that the coronavirus was being identified as hitting the US and hitting Washington State in particular. We struggled at the very end of session because we didn't know exactly what was going to happen post-session. And so actually the governor on March 12th issued a proclamation to close all the school districts in the 3 largest Western Washington counties, which was quite challenging for us to consider as we were also trying to adjourn. The very next day, he then extended the proclamation to close schools throughout Washington State. So there was just complete closure, and we were gone. So as I indicated in my chat, there's a lot of uncertainty about when we will be coming back in special session. It will be a very focused special session. But as we look back to what we accomplished, I certainly have to say that we focused on getting a major comprehensive sexual health education bill passed. That took 2 years, but it does include affirmative consent as a part of the curriculum, and it no longer offers this as an option to school district. It is now mandatory throughout all of our school districts. And of course, there was a lot of angst about that. I think what I'm really most proud of, and I'm going to ask Representative Callan to specifically speak to her efforts, but we did something that we have not done in 22 years of my service on the Washington State Education Committee, and that is to really focus in on some of the most neglected children in our schools, and that would be homeless children, children in foster care, and Representative Callan will talk about her efforts to dive deeply into children in our juvenile rehabilitation facilities. I'm really proud of her work on that because, as I say, those children are the most neglected in terms of their educational needs, and if we don't equip them, then when they are returned to community, they're not only behind in their education, they're also then not equipped to interact and rejoin society in a productive fashion. So Representative Callan, do you want to talk more about what you're doing?
Thank you, Representative Santos. And actually, I just want to give a huge shout out. Representative Santos is the chair of our House Education Committee and has really led a great bipartisan culture in that committee, which is really helpful for us to really move the dial. As I think most of us that are in here and involved in education know that education is a nonpartisan issue, and we have to make sure that every child has what they need to learn and thrive. So can you hear me okay? I'm on a headset and I can't hear myself. Okay. So one of the bills that I moved this last session was an institutional ed task force, because we were finding that our outcomes for any child that touched our juvenile justice system, their success stories and graduation rates were below 40%, really abysmal, and they were losing significant learning loss whenever they touched the juvenile justice system. And so we have to figure out a better way to actually deliver those educational services. And the way it's set up in Washington is wherever the juvenile justice system is, whether it's a detention center or a jail or a rehabilitation center or a step-down facility, wherever that facility resides, it's the school district that is in that zip code that's providing that educational service is also providing it to the youth that are incarcerated. So the funding model is separate from the standard education funding model, and the delivery of special education services and record retention and delivery and supports and how all of that is happening. Including trauma-informed practices, and all of that is just not translating well in our justice system, and our outcomes are actually, we're finding our students further behind than when they went in. And of course, their best chance of not coming back into the system is to make sure that they're graduating, even if it's a delayed year, but they are graduating and they're given the tools they need for post-secondary success. So that's what the bill was about, and got great unanimous support coming out. And so I'm thrilled to start working on that. Have our first meeting, I think, in a couple weeks.
That's great. And do you think that any of the budget cuts that you might potentially have to make will be impacting any of those efforts that either of you mentioned?
I will, go ahead. I was just going to say, there is no doubt that the efforts that are putting out there for just startup work, I'll let Representative Kellen speak to her work, but the work with foster care and homeless youth, you know, we are really, I think, looking at trying to save. We're looking at what is it, Lisa? A $4 billion shortfall. So we're having to start right now. And so one of the things that we're saying is any money that we have appropriated but have not yet spent, let's freeze those efforts if they haven't already started. That's not going to get us very much money. I think with the other efforts, namely the sex ed bill, because we actually had stepped that out, you know, it was phased in. I don't think that that's going to be necessarily challenged very much in the near future. I think once we start having that become effective in the lower grades, which is several years out, yeah, we may have to see some delays in that.
Thank you for that update. That was really interesting. Representative Weisfeld from Wisconsin, do you want to go next?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody.
Hi, thanks for joining us.
In Wisconsin, I don't know how many states are similar to ours in the way we're set up for education. We have an elected superintendent of public instruction. We do not have a state school board. And so that makes our situation different than a lot of yours. In terms of session, we are the Senate, or the Assembly, which is what I serve in. We finished up business back in February and sent, I think, over 100 bills, a few of which are my bills, over to the Senate, and then things shut down. And so we're still waiting on the Senate to finish things up. And there are a couple education related bills in there that I think are pretty important. One of them is having to do with part-time open enrollment, where a student who goes to a public school or a student who goes to a private school would be able to go take a course or two at another school. So it's, you know, they're kind of students at two schools, but it's up to 2 courses. And we've gone back and forth on that type of situation in Wisconsin the last 10 years. And this time, if we get it passed, I'm sure we've got it right. Another one would be this was my bill. We're using a private company to establish an early learning pilot program that is going to be focused on areas where we have the largest achievement gap. And in Wisconsin, that would be in Milwaukee and Madison, and I guess possibly Green Bay. It's aimed at 4-year-olds where there would be a device provided to the company. The company we largely were working with is a company called Upstart. And so maybe some of you have done something similar to this in your states as well. So we're excited to see that start going, particularly because we've had the restrictions that were placed on the state and shut down the schools. And there's a great deal of concern, as I'm sure is the case in all of your states, but even more so in Wisconsin, because we have the widest racial achievement gap in the country. And our largest public school in the state, school district in the state, is Milwaukee. And to say the least, I have not been impressed with the efforts Milwaukee has been putting forward in serving its students during this period of time. So I'm very concerned about that, and hopefully this program will be able to help those pre-kindergartners be able to be prepared for school more so than they have been previously. We also, although it's not a huge deal, I think it's important. Having been a teacher at one point in time, a lot of states have been implementing cursive in their schools. Once again, after it having kind of died down over a number of years, we're looking to get that back into Wisconsin as well. And probably the biggest issue that we fought a battle on here in Wisconsin is a long-standing battle, and that's over the issue of dyslexia. Our Department of Public Instruction was resistant to any real recognition of dyslexia, and for as long as it's been a thing. And we finally were able to get a bill passed where our department is going to be putting together a pamphlet of guidance for school districts on how to handle dyslexia. And we're hopeful, and we're going to continue pushing the issue that this is just a small start. There's a lot more that we want to do in that regard. So those are the basic things, most important things I think we did in Wisconsin this session. And like I said, we're still waiting on a couple of them to pass.
And same question to you. Do you think that any of those efforts are going to be affected at all by the economic downturn or any budget challenges you might have?
No, I don't think so. They're all, if there's any expense, it's minimal. And I don't think that they would have much of an impact.
That's really great to hear. Okay, let's see. Let's have our colleague from Kentucky join us next. Can you give us an update on what's happening there?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here today. We started off in Kentucky in January with our 60-day session. This is our budget session, where we usually prepare a 2-year budget. We started off the year with a lot of optimism about hopefully we were going to be able to do some things that we had not been able to do in quite some time. Budget-wise, I also served on appropriations and revenue as well as education. On the House side, we were able to have some increased funding for education, going back to schools, some increased funding for higher ed. Got over to the Senate. Of course, the Senate, they've always got to do things a little different than the House. I think you all understand how that works. But we were in good shape, and then this coronavirus hit and reality set in. Ultimately, instead of passing a 2-year budget, we just passed a 1-year budget because we knew there was no way that we could accurately predict what our financial economic situation was going to be in the next 6 months, 12 months. So we'll come back next year. We had to make some serious, we had to pull back on a lot of the decisions that we made. We had pay raises, we had more money. We held everybody the same. But we weren't able to make those increases. With that said, we're probably going to have to look at some more cuts. We're facing a possible special session to finish out the 2020 fiscal year next month to deal with our road plan and also our general fund as a potential. So economic reality is going to set in. It's going to impact a lot of our education. There were a lot of bills out there that did not make it across the finish line because of the situation with the virus. Normally, we only met 53 days out of the 60 days. We limited our business to the end of the year to primarily budget-related business. We did some unusual things. We actually voted remotely from our office instead of in our House chambers. That was a little bit of a historic event, but we got through that. Couple of bills that we did get through. Last year, our Senate Bill 1 was our school safety bill. We had a shooting in Kentucky, Marshall County High School a couple of years ago. A lot of work went into that school safety bill. Senator Wise, Representative Carney. I will mention, I don't know, some of you may know Representative Bam Carney. He's been in the hospital for about over 150 days now. He was in intensive care for over 100 days. I haven't got to go see him in quite some time, but last report I had, he is back in the rehab facility again, so he certainly needs your prayers. So he certainly has been going through a lot. But they'd worked on Senate Bill 1. We made some updates, tweaks to our school safety bill, Senate Bill 8. Also, we made some changes to our accountability system. We passed a law, I believe, in 2017. Made some big changes and we made some more changes. So hopefully this will be the last. But those were probably the two biggest education bills that we were able to actually get through because of the just because of the reality of not having the been able to focus on that. We had to focus on our budget and on a limited work schedule.
Thank you for that update. Representative Carney has been very much on all of our minds, and thank you for updating us on his health too. And please give him our best wishes. We really enjoyed working with him, and especially around the issue of school safety. He's been just a phenomenal presence in that space, and so we are certainly thinking of him. I would be curious if there's any other legislators or legislative staff on the call who are also from states who have shifted to the remote voting experience. I know we've been tracking this at NCSL, and this is a really fascinating issue to me, how to continue to provide continuity of government at a time when we can't be physically present. And so some states did go ahead and move forward. I know Massachusetts was one, another. Are there any other states where you had that experience where you're voting remotely? And if so, how was that? I'm seeing Mississippi was not doing remote voting. Anyone else? Okay, well, it looks like in Arizona, you were allowed to do remote voting in the House. That's very interesting. So I have asked our colleague from Mississippi, Lonnie Edgar, if he would just provide us a very quick overview of what's going on in Mississippi, particularly around the budget.
Hey y'all, can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank
Okay,
you.
perfect. Sorry I don't have any video for y'all today. I'm actually at home.
That's okay.
The legislature went home this morning, so I'm actually in the middle of my pantry trying to get everything like reorganized. So but I still wanted to jump on the call. So here I am. And kind of like the gentleman from Kentucky just mentioned, really this session has been kind of wild for us. It's definitely one that's, I mean, in my almost 16 years here as legislative staff, this is definitely the craziest session we've ever had because we are just coming off an election year. And so we always have a longer legislative session. So really the first 4 to 6 weeks is kind of the meet and greet, get back into the swing of things, get everyone acclimated to their new committee appointments and things of that nature. So really towards the end of February, everybody was kind of, happy and kumbaya moments because, the revenue projections were up for Mississippi. Everybody was in a really good position. There was a lot of talk to expand maybe like our early learning collaboratives and a couple other education initiatives that they'd really been trying to expand and build on for a couple of years now. Education is always kind of a hot topic for us in terms of equitable funding. We have something called the Mississippi Adequate Education Program Formula that really dictates our K through 12. And so there was a lot of hope that that was going to get fully funded this year as well. So everybody kind of going in was, really, really optimistic. And that's probably the best word for really all agencies and all programs. And then when COVID-19 really kind of hit, we recessed around March 15th. And then we actually just came back this week, and pretty much as a whole, every agency and entity, including education and our MAEP formula and things like that, are going to be subject to a 6.5% cut. So it's kind of really now trying to figure out exactly, what things can be cut, really kind of looking as our agencies and things like that about, what's needed, what's not, what can, take the hit, what cannot. Some agencies will be level funded. I know there's a couple of our African-American institutions at the higher learning levels that I think are going to be level funded and a few things like that. But as a whole, pretty much everyone in Mississippi is going to have to look on how they can absorb a 6.5% cut. We're hoping that that number kind of goes, down or up, depending on how you want to look at it. We hope it improves, but we just came back this week. And so I know education on the House side is meeting, I think, the beginning of next week. So I don't really have a whole lot of specific actions to report, but as a whole, it's kind of really great year coming up for the next fiscal year. And then it kind of just all got, bumped to the back. So that's kind of the snapshot as a whole here in Mississippi.
I had myself muted. Thank you for the update. We really appreciate that. It's so interesting to hear how this is playing out in all the other states. Is there anyone else who wants to jump in and just share a little bit about what has happened or you think may be coming up for you? Give it just a few seconds. Just unmute your mic and jump in. Okay, I'm going to ask you a quick polling question. So the question is, do you feel like you have accomplished everything you need to during this legislative session to address COVID? And I'm seeing the polling numbers in just a moment. I will end it and then display the results, but it looks like a solid 100% is saying no. So it looks like there's still a lot of work to be done. We can assure you that we will continue to be tracking everything as much as we possibly can so that you know what's going on in other states, and we're always here for a resource for you as you continue to go forward. But this is really interesting that you definitely feel like you've not done everything that you need to be addressing. So at this point, I did want to let you know that if you have any questions at all for either Jorge or Andrew or me about legislative sessions or about the legislation or about anything that they discussed, we are happy to take those questions. I do see that Representative Theisfeld mentioned that liability protections are needed for businesses. Yes, we are definitely hearing quite a bit about that. If you have any other topics that you feel like you need to be addressing in your state that you want to share with others, just to give them a sense, feel free to type those into the chat box as well. At this point, I'm going to share my screen again, and we are going to show you some resources that we have at NCSL that can be helpful for you. There we go. As I mentioned, NCSL has a pretty robust bill tracking effort going on within our education program and across the organization. We've created both an interactive bill tracker that tracks everything from preschool all the way up to higher education within our website at NCSL. So you can certainly access that information by going to our website. And then there's also a bill tracker that we have just released that includes everything with regard to health, employment, elections, criminal justice, and education. And then there's some other topics too. So if you're just curious in general how legislatures are responding to COVID, and perhaps even to give you some ideas of some things you might need to be thinking about in your state, you can certainly visit both of those bill trackers. And if you have any specific questions from us, just be sure to let us know. Okay, and I wanted to end by sharing with you information about upcoming meetings. Just to remind everyone, all of our meetings are always at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. On Tuesday, we will be joined by Anthony McKay and Nathan Driscoll from the National Center for Education and the Economy. They will just literally earlier that day have been with representatives from about 20 countries who will be talking about how their countries are handling the impact of the virus and what has worked well and what are their lessons learned. So we're going to have the opportunity to hear from them and what they heard from those other countries, and just sort of pick their brain about how they think that might relate to what's happening here in the US, and how those might be lessons for us going forward as we're thinking of reopening our schools this fall, or how we can reopen our schools this fall. Later in the week, we'll be joined by school leaders who will be talking to us about what it's been like on the ground and what are the discussion points or decision points that school leaders need to make and how legislators can be helping them right now. And then we're going to shift our focus to teachers and focus over a couple of virtual meetings on both the recruitment and preparation piece of this, as well as classroom supports for teachers. And then we're going to have a session with a couple of experts on reopening schools this fall. We know there's been guidance coming out from a lot of the education organizations, the CDC, Johns Hopkins, and others. And so we're going to have experts join us to talk about the guidance that they're providing for schools reopening this fall. We're also going to focus on the impact on early learning. We know that many early learning opportunities have not been available for students, certainly while we shifted to distance learning, but also as childcare centers are struggling to reopen. So this is going to be a really important discussion about how early learning will be impacted and how it could potentially move forward, and what legislators may need to keep in mind as they're making those decisions in their states. We're going to end the month, end our virtual meeting series with a discussion about the revenue forecast, get an update on how states are doing, and any new information that we have around more federal aid for states, and also how states may have been making decisions on spending the aid that they've already received. And then finally, we're going to end with a discussion on evidence-based policymaking with the new director of NCSL's Center on Evidence-Based Policymaking, and how it is that you can be thinking about using research or evidence to guide the decisions that you have to make right now. We know you're all faced with some pretty challenging decisions right now. Thank you for your time today. We really appreciate you joining us, and please join us back here on Tuesday for our discussion on lessons around the world. Have a good weekend.